So yeah, today I'm talking a little bit about Mary Queen of Scots and textual identity, but specifically about sort of the mythology of Mary, which I think ties quite well into the exhibition currently. There's a 1927 short story by Agatha Christie entitled The Face of Helen, in which two characters, Mr. Quin and Mr. Satterthwaite, meet at the opera. In time, they spot an astoundingly beautiful woman below them in the audience. And upon noticing her and the way that the other male audience members react to her, Mr. Satterthwaite remarks that he'd always wondered what such women were really like. When Mr. Quin questions just who he means by this, Mr. Satterthwaite gestures to the woman in question and replies, the Helens, the Cleopatras, the Mary Stuarts. So it's really interesting here because this isn't just a text about Mary, which compares her to these beautiful yet tragic classical women. In this example, Mary herself is the representation of sort of mythic beauty to which other women are compared. I find this a really sort of fascinating example of the way Mary has been sort of remembered and reimagined in the centuries since her death. And I think it sort of really viscerally demonstrates the fact that we really can view her as akin to a sort of modern Scottish myth, which of course also demonstrated very well at the exhibition at the moment. But today I want to talk a little bit about the fact that this isn't just a modern view of Mary. Mary was quite a divisive figure in her own period, long before she inhabited this sort of mythology of ours. And the process of mythologizing her was already well underway during her own lifetime. For example, in 1558, Scottish classicist George Buchanan, who would later become one of Mary's most ardent detractors, produced a poem on the long-awaited marriage of Mary to the Dauphin of France. This epithalamium, addressed towards Francis, lauds Mary's beauty and charm and explicitly depicts her as Helen of Troy, as on the quote on the slide there. Helen was a mythic figure with sort of intriguingly diverse connotations in the 16th century. She was, of course, the most beautiful woman in the world, Queen of Sparta and married to Menelaus, but she was kidnapped by Paris and taken to Troy as his bride. The Greek campaign to retrieve her is what sparks the Trojan War. In early modern literature, though she carries that association of her beauty, she's also commonly seen as a cause of war, a figure who causes the sort of downfall of nations. Many texts also accuse her of adultery and complicity in her own kidnapping by Paris. She is a woman who leads men astray. However, in Buchanan's 1558 text, interestingly, Mary carries only Helen's positive qualities. Buchanan notes that for Francis, described as the descendant of Trojan royalty, Venus would have handed over his Helen without slaughter. However, not all contemporary mythic representations of Mary were quite so complimentary. In fact, Buchanan himself would later be connected to some decidedly less flattering depictions of the Scottish Queen. But what I really want to point out for now is the fact that though our sort of depictions and interpretations of Mary have altered in the centuries which have passed since her death, her modern mythology can really be seen in conjunction with how she was viewed in the literature of her period. Agatha Christie's comparison of Mary to Helen is something which very much finds its roots in the 16th century writings produced whilst Mary was still alive and whilst she still occupied her throne. So, in February 1567, Mary's second husband, Lord Darnley, died under suspicious circumstances at Kirklefield in Edinburgh. Mary was accused of having plotted his death, as well as committing adultery with the chief suspect in the murder, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. The fact that Bothwell would, by May of the same year, become her third husband didn't do loads to help her reputation with this. And by summer, Mary had been imprisoned by her own lords, later being forced to abdicate and flee to England. Due to this, throughout 1567 and beyond, a massive amount of written and printed materials were produced, both by those attacking Mary as a sort of tyrant and a murderess, and by those attempting to defend her against those allegations. Both engaged to varying degrees with portraying Mary as the woman of classical myth or biblical parallel to advance their political argument. I'm going to take you through a few of these depictions now, but just know that this is really far from an exhaustive list, and we're really only scratching the surface here. So you may recognize this picture because I believe it was the one used on Eventbrite to advertise this talk. It depicts Mary as a crowned mermaid, naked from the waist up. Below her is a hare representing Bothwell, ensconced within a circle of daggers. This image comes from a placard displayed around Edinburgh in the early aftermath of Darnley's death. Mermaids in this period are often associated with vanity and sometimes with prostitution. And that Mary is depicted as one says pretty much all you need to know about what her detractors thought of her at this moment in time. But the mermaid also brings to light another example from classical mythology, that of the siren. Though in classical sources proper, sirens are actually half woman, half bird. By the medieval period, they were readily being depicted as mermaids. These creatures were said to lure sailors to their deaths with their song, forcing them to run aground in deadly rocks. The association here is that Mary was really the major cause of Darnley's death, even if Bothwell carried it out. She had been the one to lead him to it. She not only leads men into danger, but leads them to commit terrible acts in her name. You'll notice there's a little bit of a theme here with Helen's mythic beauty, which drove men to ludicrous acts. Though this is sort of an image rather than like a textual description per se, it's definitely an association which carries through the texts written in the aftermath of Darnley's death as well. The idea that Mary is a woman who uses her womanly charms and powers to lead men astray. One of the most common classical comparisons made to Mary in the aftermath of Darnley's death is that of Clytemnestra, and for pretty good reason. So in mythology, Clytemnestra is the wife of Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces who wage war on Troy in the attempt to bring back Helen. Helen being the wife of Agamemnon's brother Menelaus, but also Clytemnestra's sister. After the small matter of Agamemnon's sacrificing their eldest daughter for a fair sailing wind, just that small thing he did, Clytemnestra takes another lover, and together they murder Agamemnon upon his glorious return from Troy 10 years later. Adultery and husband murder, you can see the parallels with what some people thought of Mary at the time. Textual references to Mary as Clytemnestra abound in the aftermath of the murder and marriage. A string of anonymous broadside ballads printed in Edinburgh throughout the rest of 1567 particularly cling to the representation, notably the ballad declaring the noble and good inclination of our king, and the testady and tragedy of Henry Stuart of good memory. Most notably though, in 1567, English writer John Pickering would portray Mary as Clytemnestra in his play, A New Interlude of Vice Containing the History of Orestes. Depicting the aftermath of Agamemnon's murder when his son Orestes avenges his father's death by murdering his mother, Pickering's play was written at just the correct time to capitalise on the controversy in Scotland. Pickering, interestingly, would also later, as Speaker of the House of Commons, play a key role in helping to draft the parliamentary petition which asked Elizabeth to execute her cousin. Another well-rung representation of Mary in this period was that of Medea. Lover of the hero Jason, she is distraught when he chooses to marry another, despite her betrayal of her own father in helping him succeed in finding and winning the Golden Fleece. In her rage, she kills his new bride with a poisoned cloak, and to ensure Jason feels the same pain he caused her, she also kills both of her children by him. Because of this, Medea was the archetypal bad mother of classical mythology. Medea was also both a witch and a foreigner, aspects which were also used to defame Mary in a lot of the writing about her, especially during her imprisonment in England when Protestant commentators viewed her as a foreign threat to Elizabeth's rule. Like the image of Clytemnestra, the early broadside ballads really do cling to the representation of Mary as Medea. Some, like The King's Complaint, portray her as a specific threat to the now king, infant James VI. In his poem, James himself narrates the danger his mother poses him, saying, "Then father slain, mother was shet, my good sir flameth incontinent, Myself to poison, it was shorn, me to betray with some's intent. And of course, the most famous anti-Marian tract, in detection of the doings of Mary Queen of Scots, inextricably linked with George Buchanan himself, even claims of Mary that she maketh herself Medea, that is, a woman that neither in love nor in hatred can keep any mean. In addition to these sort of mythic tropes, many texts also painted Mary as biblical women in order to press their case against her. Her detractors invoked comparisons, especially to the likes of Jezebel and Delilah, who were both women who had used their bodies to corrupt Israel's leaders. Jezebel was also a popular symbol of Catholic corruption for Protestant reformers, used to invoke sort of ideas of tyranny and the loss of personal liberty. On the other side of the debate, Mary's defenders, like her close friend John Leslie, Bishop of Ross, would compare her to Susanna. Susanna is a woman falsely accused of adultery, who stands strong in the face of her accusers, and her accusers are then put to death for bearing false witness against her. So you can see why Mary's defenders would invoke that kind of imagery to try and heal her reputation somewhat. However, it wasn't only text written by others about Mary which depicted her in biblical and classical ways. In a footnote to an essay she writes on the adversity she's faced, Mary aligns her own suffering with the pain of Hecuba, Portia, and Dido. This example shows that Mary too was willing to align herself in text with women of classical myth, but the figures she chooses paint quite a different picture of herself from the ones that her detractors used against her. In mythology, Hecuba was the wife of Priam and Queen of Troy during its war with the Greeks. During that war and Troy's following defeat, she had to witness the death of her sons and husband, the enslavement of her daughters, and the loss of her city and its people. As a fallen queen, Hecuba really embodies tragedy. And in fact, Euripides' play Hecuba was the most popular Greek tragic play printed, translated, and performed in 16th century Europe. So she was a very popular sort of archetype of feminine tragedy at the time. However, despite her status as a tragic victim, Hecuba is also a figure who takes action. In Euripides' play, she enacts vengeance on the Greeks who've taken everything from her before her death. Though Mary may be invoking Hecuba mainly on those tragic connotations, it does seem perhaps telling that she chooses to invoke a woman who doesn't merely sit back in the face of her victimhood. A similar point can be made for the invocation of Dido. In Virgil, Dido is the tragic queen of Carthage, queen in her own right until Aeneas abandons her. In her anguish at their taking Aeneas from her, Dido tricks the gods and kills herself with his sword. Like Hecuba, Dido was one of the most famous tragic archetypes for women in the period. And what both of these examples show is Mary painting herself as a tragic victim compared to the sort of bad women of the portrayals her detractors really tried to push in their texts. Additionally, she depicts herself as a woman who is also willing to take action to right the wrongs which have been done to her by the men surrounding her. Another self-presentation by Mary, which does seem to directly answer the sort of mythic portrayals of her by others, is that of the biblical King David. In the Bible, David committed adultery with Bathsheba and was then responsible for the death of Bathsheba's husband. Yet David then becomes the archetypal penitent king and voice of the penitential psalms. David is in many ways a kind of male version of Clytemnestra, but he atones for his actions and therefore has positive rather than negative connotations. Mary invokes David in a number of ways in her writing. The most obvious is her sonnet L'Heure de Dieu, which is a paraphrase of Psalm 51, one of the 7 penitential psalms voiced by David. In this example, she herself sort of adopts the narrative position of David, inviting a comparison of her in voice to that of David, which sort of refutes the depictions of her as Clytemnestra by others. Additionally, in her Books of Hours, which are sort of small, personal, quite ornate prayer books, she, on more than one occasion, writes short verse inscriptions immediately opposite images of the penitent David in prayer, which the picture on the slide is actually one of in one of her Books of Hours. So Emily Wingfield's English translation of one such transcription reads, "Living Lord, my only judge, hear my complaints and my lamentations," which suggests that Mary's sort of inviting her reader to identify her with that penitent biblical king. These self-depictions of Mary by Mary function on a couple of different levels. They sort of both serve to depict Mary in a specific way in the eyes of her readers, whether that be as a victim or a penitent, but they also almost explicitly counter the less flattering mythical depictions of her by others. Hecuba and Dido, as archetypal tragic victims, allow Mary to become the victim of the actions of those around her rather than the perpetrator of those actions. Notably, within this, she isn't, however, powerless. She's able to take action into her own hands, as those two characters do. In Mary's case, perhaps in the form of her writing itself. The parallels drawn with the biblical King David are even more fascinating in the refutation of the derogatory mythic depictions of Mary. David's story draws almost exact parallels with that of Clytemnestra. David too was guilty of adultery and an ensuing murder. Yet David became the archetypal symbol of penitence, whilst Clytemnestra remained a symbol of womanly evil, the original bad wife. In a world where Mary's reputation had been incorrigibly damaged by her comparison to Clytemnestra, her refutations of the allegations of adultery and murder must have fallen on deaf ears. So by portraying herself instead as David, she takes control of a narrative wielded against her in an attempt to like rescue and regain that narrative for herself, taking back literary agency over her own reputation. In this way, we can really sort of see Mary as being very much aware of the specific ways she was being depicted in writing at the time and seeking to counter those with her own self-serving depictions. So what all of this comes to demonstrate is just how many myths of Mary there were floating around in her own time period. And it really shows the relevance of exhibitions like the Afterlife of Mary Queen of Scots, which chart these different versions of a historical figure like Mary through time. Some people with a more romantic view of Mary sometimes fall into the trap of trying to peel back the layers of these representations to uncover some sort of quote unquote real Mary. But sort of even discounting the multiple versions of Mary others tried to write of her during her lifetime, there wasn't even one version of Mary that she herself depicted in her writing. Her literary identity is performative and it's fluid. Much like those using her for their own political purposes, she depicted herself in different ways at different times according to what would serve her best in the moment. All of that is to say that the multiplicity of Mary you see in the physical exhibition is really a factor she played into, even if she wouldn't exactly endorse all of the depictions I've discussed here or that persist into the modern day. Thank you very much for listening.